Hello, I'm here to persuade you to advocate for racial inequality in the judicial process for people accused of crimes. First and foremost, the judicial process is the series of legal steps a legal dispute goes through in the court system. Racial inequality in the judicial process has occurred for hundreds of years, with harsh effects on minority communities. I will focus on one event where racism is very noticeable. During the crack epidemic that took place during the 1980s and 1990s, African American defendants were treated unequally. In 1986, Congress passed laws that created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for the possession or trafficking of crack when compared to penalties for trafficking of powder cocaine. The 100-to-1 rule was a federal law that imposed a 10-year sentence for anyone caught with 50 grams of crack. In contrast, someone would have been caught with 5,000 grams of powder cocaine to receive a 10-year sentence. Possession of crack and powder cocaine is essentially the same crime, which brings up the question, why is there unequal punishment for the same crime? The 1986 Act had a disparate impact on the African American community because the vast majority of defendants charged with and convicted of crack cocaine possession were African American males, while most defendants in powder cocaine possession cases were Caucasian or Latino. More African American defendants experienced the harsh crack cocaine sentences imposed by the 1986 Act because the overpriced, ease of production, and distribution of small quantities of crack cocaine sold to individuals made it more accessible in poor urban communities than powder cocaine. For those reasons, crack cocaine was a poor man's drug that was associated with African Americans. On the other hand, powdered cocaine was a drug associated with whites who had more money. Therefore, the 1986 Act treated poor minorities harsher than privileged whites for no logical reason. Some might say that the 100-to-1 rule was just because African Americans committed more drug-related crimes than other races, and that is why more African Americans were incarcerated. This cannot be true because, in 2005, African Americans represented 14% of current drug users, yet they constituted 33.9% of persons arrested for a drug offense and 53% of persons sentenced to prison for a drug offense, end quote. In other words, African Americans only accounted for a small portion of drug users, but they made up almost half of the population sentenced to prison for a drug offense. Another statistic shows that, quote, in 2000, blacks represented about 63% of all drug offenders in state prison, while whites made up about 37%. But the number of white drug users is much higher than that of black drug users, end quote. Because there are more white drug users than black drug users, there should have been more white Americans arrested and in jail. Since black Americans made up 63% of drug offenders in prison, this shows that there was racial inequality in the judicial process, and it needs to be stopped. Furthermore, the Catholic Church believes that racism is a sin and goes against the image of God. For example, in the Brothers and Sisters to Us, the U.S. Catholic bishops state that, quote, racism is a sin that divides the family, blots out the image of God among specific members of that family, and violates the fundamental human dignity of those called to be children of the same Father. Racism is the sin that says some human beings are inherently superior and others essentially inferior because of races, end quote. The most applicable Catholic social teachings on racism are life and dignity of the human person and rights and responsibilities. First, life and dignity apply to racial inequality in the judicial process because the Church states that, quote, human life is sacred and the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. We believe that every person is precious, end quote. This quote by the Church shows that all human life is special and we need to preserve it no matter the cost. Blacks and whites should be treated equally in order for there to be a base in which society can grow. Second, Rights and responsibilities are applicable because the Church states that, quote, human dignity can be protected and a healthy community can be achieved only if human rights are protected and responsibilities are met, end quote. This quote by the Church shows that human rights must be protected in order for a healthy community to be achieved. A basic human right is the right of equality, and if all races abide by it, society would be able to flourish. Racism in the justice system heavily impacted the African American community. The 1986 Act resulted in many African Americans being incarcerated for felony drugs for crack cocaine. These black men then lost access to voting, housing, and employment opportunities. Many families were broken up when fathers and brothers were incarcerated. As a result, many black families suffered economic losses, which led to increased violent crime in poor black communities as families did what they had to do in order to survive. Due to the racism that is prevalent in the justice system, the African American community was deprived of a healthy community. The last applicable Catholic social teaching on racism is solidarity. This teaching applies to racial inequality in the justice system because the Catholic Church stated that, quote, we are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers, wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in a shrinking world, end quote. This quote by the Church shows that all people, no matter their race, economic class, or other differences, are one family. Essentially, everyone is equal and should be treated with the same amount of respect because factors that could potentially make someone better than one another would be eliminated. The Catholic Church wants its followers to only view people as humans. Therefore, nobody would be superior and everyone would be a family. Solidarity allows for all people to be viewed the same. If this Catholic social teaching could be applied to racial equality in the judicial system, there would never be unequal sentencing because defendants wouldn't be judging based on the color of their skin. In conclusion, racial inequality present in the judicial process during the crack epidemic shows that racism should be eliminated in the legal system. The unequal punishment for the same crime, which would be possession of drugs, negatively impacted the African American community for decades. If racial inequality continues to occur, then more shameful events in our country's history will keep happening. But if you advocate against racial inequality in the judicial system, these injustices will never occur again.